Welcome to U.S. History to 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history through Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on Cahokia, corn, and native political order before 1492. The core question is this: what does a nation inherit when the first large public works on the continent were indigenous rather than European? The core competency is to confirm the contributions of native peoples to the subsequent development of life in America.
What does a nation inherit when the first large public works on the continent were indigenous rather than European? North America before 1492 contained built environments that required planning, labor, storage, exchange, and authority. Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, stands at the center of that fact. Between about 1050 and 1350, Cahokia grew into the largest urban center north of Mexico. Monk's Mound rose about 100 feet high and spread across a broad base that still dominates the site. Plazas opened around the mounds, houses clustered in neighborhoods, palisades marked space, causeways and ceremonial areas organized movement. None of that work happened through accident. People cut wood, hauled earth, shaped construction platforms, and maintained the site over generations. Cahokia commands attention because it joined agriculture, religion, labor, and hierarchy in one place. The city stood near major river systems that link the Mississippi Valley to distant regions. Water routes moved people and goods. Agricultural surplus fed builders and leaders. Religious authority gave meaning to public space. Political authority coordinated labor. Those elements together created an indigenous city whose scale still unsettles the empty continent story. A mound is not scenery. It is evidence of administration, food supply, and repeated collective work. The size of Cahokia also shows that native people solved the same practical questions later empires would face. How do you feed a concentrated population? How do you organize work beyond a household? How do you mark authority in public space? How do you move goods across distance? How do you preserve a common story? Cahokia answered those questions through local knowledge rather than European forms of stone masonry, written charters, or fenced private parcels. The site demonstrates that public order existed in North America long before Europeans wrote about the continent. Archaeologists have found shell beads, copper, stone tools, ceramics, and evidence of far-reaching exchange at Cahokia. Those finds show that the city sat inside a network rather than in isolation. Exchange required trust, custom, root knowledge, and political contact. Trade goods do not travel by themselves. People carry them across territories where rules governed movement. Native North America therefore entered the historical record as a continent of movement, diplomacy, production, and built space. When later colonists described wilderness, they often meant land, not organized according to European law. Cahokia reveals the weakness of that claim. The landscape already carried native decisions in its fields, earthworks, settlements, and river corridors. The first contribution of native peoples to later American development was therefore physical and institutional at the same time. They shaped the continent before colonists tried to rename it. Three Sisters agriculture helps explain how native societies sustained dense life across wide areas. Corn, beans, and squash grew together in a mutually reinforcing system. Corn provided the stalk, beans climbed the stalk and returned nutrients to the soil. Squash spread over the ground, helping control weeds and retain moisture. The method reflected observation, trial, and seasonal discipline. It also produced reliable food surpluses that could support permanent settlement and specialized labor. Maize agriculture spread gradually from earlier cultivation traditions and became a foundation for many native communities. Corn could be stored and redistributed. Storage changed the scale of social life because it allowed communities to plan beyond immediate harvest cycles. A society with dependable food reserves could support craft workers, builders, traders, diplomats, and religious leaders. Food, therefore, became part of governance. The people who supervised planting schedules, storage, and redistribution helped hold the larger community together. Agriculture also interacted with environment. Native farmers adjusted fields to local soils, rainfall patterns, and river floods. They used controlled burns in some regions to manage landscapes, support game, and protect settlements. They cleared space carefully and understood plant cycles through long habitation. Environmental engineering often appeared through managed burns, field placement, and route planning rather than through walls or roads alone. Forest edges, field systems, managed burns, and transportation routes all reflected native planning. Trade networks extended that planning far beyond one valley. Shell from the Gulf Coast, copper from the Great Lakes region, stone from distant quarries, and other goods moved across broad routes. Traders needed safe passage and reciprocal relationships. Exchange also moved stories, ritual forms, and political information. Regional networks made it possible for innovations in agriculture, craft, and diplomacy to circulate long before Atlantic empires entered the continent. Native societies varied across regions, yet they shared one large fact. They were historical communities with economies, land systems, and rules. Pueblo peoples in the Southwest built multi-story settlements and irrigation systems. Peoples of the Pacific Northwest developed fishing economies and complex social ranking. Woodland and plain societies adapted to their own ecologies through different combinations of farming, hunting, and exchange. The point is not sameness. The point is organized life. North America held many political and environmental systems, and each one solved local problems through knowledge accumulated across generations. That wider context anchors the argument because Cahokia was not a solitary wonder. It was one visible expression of a larger native world. When Europeans later borrowed crops, depended on guides, negotiated alliances, or fought wars for territory, they were entering lands already shaped by those systems. The contributions of native peoples were not marginal gifts added to a European story. They were the operating conditions of the continent itself. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy reveals a different kind of native contribution. It shows political design. The Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca joined in a confederated system that coordinated peace and diplomacy in the Northeast. The Confederacy did not erase local identities. It created procedures through which separate nations could settle disputes, manage common concerns, and act together when needed. That structure stabilized diplomacy because it transformed political survival into a repeatable practice. Council politics required patience, memory, and recognized authority. Leaders needed to persuade rather than simply command. Deliberation followed accepted forms. Kinship systems shaped legitimacy. In many Haudenosaunee communities, descent and clan identity passed through women. Matrilineal order influenced belonging, inheritance, and the selection of some leaders. European observers often misread such systems because they expected male-headed households and written property law to define political civilization. The Confederacy shows that indigenous political order rested on different premises and still produced durable regional power. Diplomacy also made the Haudenosaunee important to later imperial history. French, Dutch, and English actors had to negotiate with native nations that already possessed military capacity, territorial knowledge, and alliance networks. Europeans could not declare mastery and make it true by proclamation alone. They needed trade partners, military support, and access through lands they did not control. Native confederated power shaped those dealings from the first meetings onward. Oral tradition held that political order together. Laws, origin narratives, treaty understandings, and civic memory moved across generations through disciplined speech and ceremony. An oral archive requires repetition, trained remembrance, and communal enforcement. It is not the absence of record, it is a different record system. That is decisive because colonists later treated written paper as the only valid proof of title, promise, or sovereignty. Native communities had long preserved memory and obligation without relying on European paperwork. Cahokia and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy show two different scales of native contribution. Cahokia makes labor and public works visible. The Confederacy makes diplomacy and political design visible. Three Sisters agriculture shows ecological intelligence. Trade networks show circulation across distance. Oral tradition shows law and history preserved outside print. Together, these examples make a factual claim that later American development cannot escape. Colonists inherited land, food systems, transportation knowledge, and political realities they did not create. Native contributions also survived inside colonial dependence. Colonists adopted corn. They relied on native route knowledge. They learned local seasons and survival techniques from people already living on the land. Even when colonists denied native sovereignty, they depended on native systems to stay alive. The contradiction would shape the rest of early American history. Christopher Columbus's 1493 letter to Louis de Saint-Angel reveals the tension between European observation and European claim. Columbus described the islands as filled with people numberless. That phrase is decisive because it records populated land. The voyage did not discover emptiness. It encountered communities. Columbus saw settlement, people, and potential exchange. He also saw the possibility of conquest, conversion, and royal advantage. The same letter moves quickly from observation to possession. Columbus wrote that he took possession of all of them for our most fortunate king. The sentence shows how imperial authority operated on paper. A sailor backed by a monarch could enter inhabited space, perform a ritual act of claiming, and convert human presence into royal property through written report. The document did not ask whether the people on those islands possessed their own sovereignty. It assumed that Spanish naming and Spanish ceremony could overwrite native standing. That assumption shaped colonization because later colonization would rely on the same habit. European powers repeatedly treated documents, charters, and maps as if they created authority on contact. Native political systems remained visible in the land and in diplomacy, yet imperial writing often pushed them aside. Columbus's letter shows the beginning of that pattern in a compact form. The author knows the islands are inhabited, but he still writes as though royal possession follows naturally from arrival. The letter also makes clear why native contributions were easy for colonizers to use and easy for them to erase. European newcomers could take crops, routes, and local knowledge while refusing to recognize native law. They could describe native peoples as useful or convertible while denying them political equality. The letter does not hide that structure. It displays it. Observation serves appropriation. The historical tension therefore sits inside the source itself. Columbus acknowledges populated worlds and then writes them into empire. That contradiction becomes a durable feature of American history. Indigenous systems remain necessary on the ground and dismissed on the page. A continent already shaped by native labor becomes a continent later narrated as if Europeans began the real story. The factual consequence is clear. American history begins in a continent already organized by native peoples. Cahokia demonstrates urban scale and public works. Maize agriculture demonstrates food science and stored surplus. Haudenosaunee diplomacy demonstrates political design. Oral tradition demonstrates memory and law preserved without print. Trade networks demonstrate regional exchange long before Atlantic empires crossed the ocean. These systems do not sit outside the later American story. They make the later story possible. When colonists survived by planting corn, following established routes, or bargaining with native nations, they were operating inside native conditions. When later governments argued over land cessions, treaties, removal, and sovereignty, they were still confronting native political realities that predated the United States by centuries. Starting with native systems, therefore, changes the scale of responsibility in the national story. European arrival becomes one collision among already existing worlds rather than the beginning of history on the continent. The written record then adds another consequence. European letters, maps, and claims became the documents later institutions preserved most carefully. Earthworks eroded, oral records were often discounted, native communities endured, but colonial archives carried disproportionate authority in schools, courts, and public memory. A factual lecture on Cahokia and native political order corrects that imbalance by restoring older evidence to the front of the story. This restoration does not depend on sentiment. It depends on visible structures. Mounds remain, planning systems remain historically traceable. Confederated diplomacy remains documented through native and European encounters. Archaeology, oral tradition, and comparative history together show that indigenous peoples made enduring contributions to agriculture, governance, transportation, and environmental management. The early United States inherited those conditions whether later Americans admitted it or not. The unresolved judgment is therefore not whether native peoples contributed to later American life. The evidence already settles that question. The harder issue is what happens to national memory when the first large institutions on the land were indigenous institutions. Once that fact is restored, every later chapter about land, sovereignty, settlement, and citizenship carries a different weight. The evidence of native contribution is already overwhelming. The harder judgment is what public memory owes once the earliest large institutions on the land are recognized as indigenous institutions later treated as background. Every later argument about land, sovereignty, and settlement becomes heavier once that fact is admitted.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.